Sometimes the reality is stranger than a fictional story. Today we will delve into a story so unbelievable that it will make you question everything. We post a new story every Tuesday and Friday, so stay tuned. On January 6, 1939, a 23-year-old man named Joe Arridy was serving time as a death row inmate in the Colorado prison. He was famously known as the happiest person on death row because of his ever-positive nature and, most importantly, his infectious smile that would melt the hearts of even his toughest and most notorious fellow prisoners. His innocent demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the usual atmosphere of a death row facility. Fellow inmates and prison staff alike were sheepishly drawn to Joe's pure-heartedness. His ability to remain cheerful in such a setting was nothing short of a mystery. Even the prison warden, Roy Best, held a special place in his heart for Joe, often referring to him as his son. Roy, a man accustomed to the hardened realities of prison life, found something in Joe that resonated deeply with him. This was unusual in the strict, disciplined world of prison life, but Joe's presence transcended these boundaries, bringing a sense of humanity and lightness that was rare and deeply valued. His smile, wide and genuine, had a rare purity that touched everyone around him. Joe's presence in the prison was a reminder of the innocence and goodness that can exist even in the most unlikely places. But Joe Arridy's sentence in prison was tied to a crime that seemed at odds with his gentle nature. He was convicted for a violent and harrowing incident that had taken place a few years earlier. Joe Arridy was on death row due to his conviction for a crime that shocked and appalled the local community. The incident in question was a brutal attack on two young sisters, Barbara and Dorothy Drain, in their family home. On the night of August 14th, an assailant broke into the Drain residence, unleashing an unimaginable horror. During this vicious attack, both sisters were mercilessly beaten and raped. The assailant used a hatchet, inflicting severe blows to their heads. Barbara, the younger of the two at just 12 years old, miraculously survived despite her grave injuries. However, 14-year-old Dorothy, caught in the brutality of the assault, was less fortunate. The wounds she suffered were fatal, and she succumbed shortly after the attack. The small community was left reeling in the wake of this violence, struggling to comprehend how such a savage act could occur in their midst. The attacks were so heinous and brutal that the entire community burst out with anger. It was a crime that no one could come to terms with, and that brought incredible pressure on the local police to nab the violent perpetrator. Joe was identified and convicted for the crime, and promptly sentenced to death for the vicious nature of the attack. But for those who knew Joe, it was extremely difficult to imagine him committing such a horrifying crime. They simply could not come to terms with Joe's reality because the boy they knew was incapable of intentionally hurting even a fly, let alone carrying out such heinous acts. And it was true. As it turned out, Joe Arridy was innocent of the crimes for which he was convicted. He was a mentally challenged 23-year-old with an IQ of only 46, possessing the intellectual capacity of a 6-year-old child. Joe did not have the intellectual ability to even understand the crime he was convicted for, and was completely unaware of the basic concept of death. He simply did not understand why he was locked up or what death row meant. Born into a family of Syrian immigrants, Joe's parents were first cousins, a factor that likely contributed to his intellectual challenges. From birth, Joe faced communication barriers. He was mute and did not speak until the age of 5. Tragically, several of Joe's siblings passed away young, and one of his surviving brothers was also deemed intellectually disabled. Joe struggled to fit in with his peers. After only a year in elementary school, the principal advised his father that Joe should be removed from the school, as he couldn't keep up with the other children. When Joe was 10, his father, who worked at a steel company, lost his job. Facing financial and caregiving challenges, he made the difficult decision to send Joe to a state home for mental defectives. In this institution, away from the comfort and safety of his family, Joe faced constant bullying and even physical assault due to his vulnerabilities and lack of self-defense capability. The head of the home later revealed that Joe was often attacked and gang-raped by the other boys in the facility, and often forced to take the fall for incidents like petty theft and vandalism, despite his innocence. After a decade in this challenging environment, Joe finally decided to run away at the age of 21. It was during the Great Depression, a time when many were hopping trains across the country, searching for better opportunities. Joe joined these wanderers, which eventually led him to the rail yards in Cheyenne, Wyoming in August 1936, a pivotal moment that would tragically entangle him in a crime he didn't commit. As the investigation into the attack on the Drain sisters continued, the police efforts eventually led to the arrest of Frank Aguilar, a Mexican laborer who had previously been employed by the girl's father. Aguilar soon became the prime suspect in this horrific case. The evidence against Aguilar began to mount. An axe head, believed to be the murder weapon, was found at his residence. More compellingly, Barbara Drain, the surviving victim, positively identified Aguilar as the attacker. This identification was a critical turning point in the investigation. Eventually, Aguilar confessed to the crime. His confession, alongside the physical evidence and eyewitness identification, seemed to conclusively link him to the brutal assault. In 1937, Frank Aguilar was executed for the murder of Dorothy Drain and the assault on Barbara. However, even with Aguilar's confession and execution, there was one police officer named Sheriff George Carroll, who was not completely convinced. He continued his investigation, leading to the unfortunate and wrongful arrest of Joe Arridy, who was found roaming around the train tracks and could not fully articulate why he was there. The arrest of Arridy was primarily due to his non-native accent and skin color, rather than any concrete evidence linking him to the crime. Sheriff George Carroll, who led the investigation, subjected Joe to dreadful and aggressive interrogation 8 hours straight. The interrogation of Joe, who struggled with basic comprehension and communication, was conducted without any official record or legal representation. Despite Joe's clear lack of understanding of the situation, Sheriff Carroll manipulatively extracted a confession that Joe didn't even understand, implicating him in the heinous crime. Joe's arrest was shrouded in blatant racism and prejudice. The trial that followed was a tragic miscarriage of justice. Joe, with his limited mental capacity, was ill-equipped to defend himself against the leading and manipulative questions posed by the prosecution. His legal representation failed to effectively convey the extent of his intellectual disability and its impact on his ability to participate meaningfully in his defense. As a result, Joe Arridy was convicted and sentenced to death, a decision that was later widely criticized for its apparent disregard for his mental condition and the lack of substantial evidence linking him to the crime. But his time in prison, though marked by his characteristic innocence and cheerfulness, was a stark contrast to the grave injustice that led him there. The time he spent on death row was ironically better than the life he had outside. He was protected and cared for by his fellow inmates. He was safer with the most dangerous criminals in the community than he was with those who were supposed to help and provide for him. The warden of the facility would bring him toys to play with and treats. His favorite was the toy train that he would proudly show off to everyone in the prison. Despite what the justice system convicted Joe of, the warden knew in his heart that those allegations were not true, and Joe was simply a victim of the unjust and bigoted system. Roy Best became the father that Joe never had. Warden Roy, along with many other people, made several attempts to appeal against his death penalty, but all their requests fell to deaf ears. When offered his choice of Last Supper, he requested ice cream, but he didn't seem to grasp the fact that this was going to be his last meal. Even at the day of his execution, Joe's primary concern that day had nothing to do with death or the afterlife. It was whether or not he would be able to finish the ice cream that he had requested as his last meal. Once the warden assured him that his ice cream would be saved for him, Joe Arridy walked up the hill to the gas chamber, accompanied by the warden and the prison chaplain. Joe didn't resist, because he was oblivious to what was about to happen to him. On his fateful last day, his mother came to visit him, but left before the execution. Before the guards led him to the gas chamber, someone asked him about his imminent death, and Joe didn't seem to understand. He simply responded, "Joe won't die." Then he entered the chamber. The guards strapped him to the chair while a grinning Joe Arridy looked all around him. For a moment, a wave of nerves overcame him, but the warden consoled the poor boy by holding his hand. Everything was peaceful for a moment. Joe sat smiling in the chair, while the rest of the room silently waited in tears for what only they knew was coming next. Joe Arridy became one of the youngest Americans to ever be executed. What's more, the severity of his mental disability, coupled with the lack of evidence collected during the trial, makes this case one of the most tragic examples of unlawful execution in the history of the United States. On January 7, 2011, Colorado Governor Bill Ritter granted a full and unconditional posthumous pardon to Joe Arridy, who had been convicted and executed as an accomplice to a murder that occurred in 1936. The pardon came 72 years after Arridy's execution and is the first such pardon in Colorado history. During his short and tragic life, Joe brought happiness and innocence to those around him, despite his circumstances. He left a lasting impact on those he came in contact with him. Thank you for watching this video. For more content like this, stay tuned and subscribe to our channel. Stay safe, and until the next time.